Thanks, Marta. Yes, it's very nice to be back at the British School at Rome. And I was asked if I might reflect on how my time in Italy and Rome might have nourished or rerouted my work. And really, it's not something I need much poking to do. In the course of working on paintings, very often we realize that we're trying to open up certain conditions to revisit prime aesthetic experiences. And though it feels an unhealthily nostalgic symptom to admit, I must confess to a conviction that a great part of the scenery of memory is arranged in childhood. But these are topped up occasionally by vignettes as life goes on too. It would be rather bleak if this weren't the case. Trying to access these memories can feel like the process of apprehending when spotting distant, more or less sun-bleached fiberglass forms on the beach. They have a vivid allure, but are not fully graspable. Martin Heidegger's idea of the truth of objects revealing themselves, shining in a clearing, and immediately concealing themselves again chimes with me. I've also benefited from Kazuo Ishiguro's exploration of the dreamlike, unreliable texture of memory in his novels, and the strange updating of the enigma of the everyday offered by the unbelievably granular level of detailed recollection in Karl Ove Knausgaard's cycle of novels My Struggle. The memoirs of Giorgio de Chirico have also been a long-standing influence. The sense that de Chirico looked at the world through metaphysical goggles and took snapshots of the ineffable, rejecting the fluff. I'm interested in what remains in the colander of experience and the weathering effect on these memories, where, as in dreams, they have a paradoxical quality of feeling vivid, dynamically contoured, and specific, and yet gauzy, distant, foggy, fleeting, all the rest. In my paintings and sculpture, I tend to work with things that keep kind of tapping me on the shoulder rather than using strategized choices, allowing collective motifs to appear ideally in a sort of chain of composition from the back of my mind. Artists have a stage to work with these distant forms in a peculiarly haptic, sensuous way, as if they were mounds of plasticine that might cooperate to some degree and kind of meet you halfway. So for this talk, I wanted to see if it would be fruitful to stick to what I found was still in the colander, what had forms that were idiosyncratic enough not to slip through the holes, what wasn't run-of-the-mill, or if it is run-of-the-mill, kind of lyrically run-of-the-mill. Using these as stepping stones, I'll try and knit them together a little and reflect on what these things stand for, what qualities are ambassadors for, and even how they might have rewired my output. As you'll already have gathered, I'm quite willing to deal in mixed metaphors. Mixed metaphors are my stock in trade, and I'm committed to a profusion of themes at the risk of mild confusion in an attempt to be true to life. So in May 2012, while I was resident here, a lupine man, a native Roman, was pointing out a few highlights to me in an art fair held in the former slaughterhouses in Testaccio, now home to an annex of Macro. Deep in the hall, after the discovery of a work by Carla Accardi, comprising, as I recall, an array of elegant green staccato brushstrokes in regular intervals over a clear plastic parasol, and miniaturized, covetable works by Alberto Burri. After these were a number of sheets by, I was to learn, the graphic artist Andrea Pazienza, including this work. Drawn when he must have been only 17 or so, the slogan, the true Italian pop art, seems laced with a kind of qualifying irony, almost a certain ruefulness in its surrendering to cliché. There's something inadequate about a plate of spaghetti standing for a whole culture, and this casts the mooted true Italian pop art by implication as a kind of fool's errand. The spaghetti and the true Italian pop art are mirages. You feel the true Italian pop art does not exist, not least due to the narcotic accent of his intense felt tipping. Pazienza, revered as I know in Italy, to my mind should really be more widely known, possessed of an uncannily versatile draftsmanship. He seems able to kind of speak in tongues, shifting from a kind of honeyed pastoral scene in a lush palette to something more abruptly summery and bawdy in black and white, but while maintaining some kind of signature through line. A well-loved script is always mentioned by those who know him, perché people sembra uno spalato, why Goofy looks like he's high. And he was apparently exceedingly fond of Goofy, citing the Disney artist Carl Barks as a formative influence, though a perusal of Paz's work will just as rapidly disclose a deep intimacy with the more muscular Michelangelan strains of Renaissance disegno. A heroin addict, he died a similar age to Georges Seurat, who, as far as I know, was not a heroin addict, but he seems to me at times a kind of Seurat of the felt tip, with this prismatic, woozy sense of colour. Enzo Apicella. Some years later in London, calling into the nearest branch of the pizzeria Franco Manca, such as the hypertrophic proliferation of the sourdough pizzeria, that there is now one just 5 minutes from our front door, There's something in the corner of my eye, prints on the wall. They appear cut from the same cloth as those I remember gazing at, 5 years old, in our local branch of Pizza Express. It turns out that these drawings, reminiscent of Saul Steinberg, with a dash of Bruno Munari, are by designer and restaurateur Enzo Apicella, an integral figure to the dining out revolution and Italomania of the 60s in the UK, and highly adept at repackaging Italian culture for the British market, with raffishly irreverent interiors. You'll find him name-checked in the preface to the umpteenth edition of Elizabeth David's Italian Food, for example. The image that was lodged in my mind, and it was only when I went into Franco Manca that I realized who was responsible for it. In this, there was a sort of infinite diner countertop, a bit like this, stretching into the infinite distance, and on a counter there were plates mounded obscenely with a sort of surplus of spaghetti, and strange squat figures hunched over them. I don't think this image exists other than in my memory. It seems to be a crossbreed of Apicella images. Spaghetti is a favourite motif of his, surging, flowing, coiling, being hoovered up into greedy men's mouths. It seems only dimly related to actual food, standing for needs and appetites of all sorts, a throbbing line in an emptied-out, symbolic realm, where, as with most cartoons, the ostensible joke is the least interesting part, lower wattage than the briskly outlined room or landscape, speedily hatched shadows, and above all, an atmosphere of breezy nihilism. This was my introduction to a strain of mild surrealism that I've never really been able to shake off. Why do I dwell on restaurant reverie? Well, perhaps at rest waited on, we're impressionable. It's not that I'm particularly a gourmet, but the scenery and ceremony of restaurants is hypnotic. Bowls and plates come and go, arrangements of ingredients arrive, bordering on the formless but contained in rigid formats, abstraction and distraction from time slipping away. Things in restaurants, I feel, leave kind of pillow mark impressions on us. Rachel Cusk reflects on a kind of phenomenology of the pizza in her sharply rendered travelogue, The Last Supper, A Summer in Italy. Cusk, uncannily spot on in her thumbnails of people, makes a provocative detour into the life of Italian food as a sort of diaspora, taking to task the English for their almost indecent reverence for the basic staples of the Italian diet. Pizza, she proposes, is a kind of open smiling face, happily accepted by children the world over, as it lays all its components bare on its surface. The kind of authenticity sold in Waitrose magazines doesn't quite correspond to the experience of dining at an authentic hole-in-the-wall restaurant like Sora Margherita in the ghetto. Stranieri, who have managed to make it past the smiling but none too encouraging doorman, a man in pristine yellow Nikes and Prussian blue gilet, liable to send you away to return in 90 minutes. Those who have managed to get a table in what feels like a converted janitor's office, where there is a bizarre closet containing the toilet more or less freestanding at the back, as in one of Fellini's dream drawings. Those who are awaiting their mound of golden fettuccine in a landslide of ricotta, perhaps plucking at the giant fir cone of a fried artichoke, have a pleased, expectant air, as those who are in line to meet royalty, because perhaps they feel they have truffled out what has eluded those who wantonly squander their hours in Rome at cynical establishments with Coca-Cola menus: authenticity. I love these walls, plastered in business cards and heartfelt scribbled notes, a kind of chorus of thanks and praise. Please keep this table reserved for me forever. Or of a different tenor, the sadness of San Callisto Tramezzini. These bring out the animist in me, feeling sorry for these anemic sandwiches. Marooned late at night, mummified in cling film, apparently unwanted, they seem full of sympathetic sadness and mono no aware. And I was reminded of these rewatching the Wim Wenders film documentary Tokyo Ga, where he films a young Japanese craftsman in the mid-80s assembling an uncanny sampuru tramezzino, the wax replicas of food that were used originally to show to foreigners what was available inside the restaurant. Another man half vacantly airbrushing a wax disc with an irate red, conjuring a kind of mutant pizza, and an example of the cartooned emigre life of Italian food. As Elizabeth David notes, the notion of an umbrella term of Italian food is problematic, so I use it here to refer to Italian food as the unspecialized kind of popular global imagination. As Rachel Cusk says, consider the pizza. All around the world, the pizza has come to represent the deepest forms of security known to the human palate. It is like a smiling face. It assuages the fear of complexity by showing everything on its surface. The pizza has nothing to hide, no dark interior, no subconscious fascination with its own viscera. I might quibble with the last point. Her use of the word viscera reminds me of associations that have always wafted into mind that suggest a more brutal shadow life of the pizza. Not that this should deter anyone from eating them, naturally. It comprises a crust and a molten center that's somewhat magmatic and is unsettling in the way that it is to consider the fiery ball rumbling beneath us in the earth. They're somewhat intestinal and remind of spilled innards. And I've always been reminded of them sort of a strange association with these Jurassic Park toys of the early 90s, where they had this dino damage feature where you'd push a little button, part of the flesh would pop off, revealing a red and white pattern. That may be just me, but... The Alexander Mosaic from the House of the Faun in Pompeii, late 2nd or early 1st century BC. As Bob Dylan so delicately put it in his Nobel lecture, most everything is a knockoff of something else. And indeed, this is thought to be a close copy of a Greek painting by Philoxenus of Eretria, which Pliny mentions, perhaps commissioned by Alexander the Great. I must admit that while it's instructive to note these temporal details, as far as I'm concerned, they're a kind of interesting spice, a separate realm that doesn't really shed light on why something really sings. In the Alexander Mosaic, it's the horse's rump that has lodged in my memory. And this, I think, is thanks to the unusually subtle gradations of colour in the horse's rump, the sophisticatedly idiosyncratic banded shapes in which the tesserae are laid down in what's known as opus vermiculatum, like worm tracks. The gradations of tan on the horse's rump, bands of colour precisely weighted to give sensitive yet absolutely distinct tonal shifts. These could be the desert plain bordering the road ahead in the driving video game Outrun, demarcations of distance scrolling towards you, suggestive of the limits of sight, cognition, the envisioned future, perhaps the distance left of the earthly race. And indeed, the horse's rump seems to scroll towards us and away from us at the same time. The palest tones, and therefore the most dimensionally prominent on the horse's backside or hoof, have required a moment of stylization, an invention of this kind of idiosyncratic shape to both convincingly approximate the play of light and an organic form, but also extract oneself from the solution of depictedness with a kind of elegant abstraction, not unlike the chef making peace with the final arrangement of his tangle or tumble of ingredients as he kind of backs away from the work. Seen as part of the whole, it moves like clockwork, but if you concentrate on this kind of lung-like, mozzarella-like fleck in isolation, it begins to seem uncanny, as if it is only assented to do its job in conjuring form on a kind of provisional basis. And I think this swing between the kind of suspension of disbelief, the illusion, and then you suddenly see the spookiness of the form itself as the sort of tug on the fishing line of mosaics. Look how grand experience can be broken down into little chips, and illusions sweep us along. And look how it can fall away and disintegrate, how impressions run through our fingers. The next thing that kind of lodged in my mind like a slide was from the Casa dei Griffi, the House of the Griffins, in the Palatine Hill, and this marble trompe l'oeil from about 100 to 50 BC. And I always thought they didn't really look like marble, they looked like something more vegetal, like sort of slices of kimchi or something. There was something about the dance of brushstrokes in itself that reminded me actually of the great American pop artist James Rosenquist. Because as in Rosenquist, there's kind of this, like in the sponge cake in his painting, The President-Elect, there's something fragile about the figuration, like a certain price has been paid for the kind of the dairy softness of his billboard painted technique. Yet at the same time, it works, and there's a cool detachment, and the dance of these melting and wispy passages of paint, all soft boundaries, and aqueous white highlights recalling moistening eyes or street lamps pooling in puddles. These things have an ethereal strangeness of its own that transcends the mundanity of its putative subject. The next thing was some kind of image of pine needles. For whatever reason, the image on the sort of cover page of the photo album in my memory of Roman frescoes is a close-up of pine needles, lazily graceful strokes into wet plaster where the artist has apparently summoned pine needles just by inclining his head towards them as a kind of party trick. Looking back through my photos, I can't find an example that quite matches up with this recollection. Some kind of synthesis or fabrication has taken place in a sort of background operation. of my mind. Memories of paintings swell and continue to give off wafts after seeing them, and I've come to see this less as a kind of deception and more as the main event of experiencing paintings, the after image being a very real and prime stage of the way we take pictures on board. These are from a selection of places like that, from the famous Garden of Livia. The Museo della Civiltà Romana in the Eo district. Search online for the museum today and you'll find the tombstone-like pronouncement in its Google profile, permanently closed. Indefinitely shuttered, it seems, for refurbishment that some don't have high hopes of ever seeing completed. There are mournful posts from TripAdvisor reviewers who lament their many previous attempts to visit the museum, falling foul of its stingy opening hours, staff strikes, or readiness to honour obscure holidays. A pity, because for anyone with a burgeoning interest in Roman relief sculpture, this is an essential pit stop. And through my goggles at least, a long bath in a peculiar, ineffable and aesthetic experience. In large part, this is due to everything being a cast or a model, not original. The vast palatial proportions of the rooms, the strangely kind of constellated extended layout, and the sun-bleached, out-of-season marina colours of the walls all contribute to this. And this is a thing that, again, was sort of stuck to me like a burr to my clothes. A topographical map showing Caesar's invasion of Alesia that looms on the wall, with all the oddity of those first atlas terrains that you saw on the wall at school, but also like a great slab of herb-encrusted cheese, albeit a snotty cheese, on nodding terms with the gluey papier-mâché modelled valleys, dales and plateaus of wargaming. Somehow its particular diagrammatic meaning is less of interest than its eerie attitude. It seems reeking of meaning. A hunk of more or less willing material fashioned into what appears an embodiment of a hinterland, a unit of meaning plucked from the ether or from a giant encyclopedia, and hung like a hide in a sort of dilapidated mind palace. Trophy reliefs in the courtyard of the Capitoline Museums, originally from the Hadrianum. The trophy has been a bit of a pet idea for me in terms of something to think about as an equivalent or analogue for what I might be trying to do in painting. A bit like those sort of toddler learning toys where you're trying to insert coloured blocks into particular holes. I keep trying to sort of apply it to what I'm doing, but I think there's something to it. I was immediately drawn to the arch, fanciful arrangements of arms and armour in these trophy relief panels. And the idea is that these, from the sort of a recently conquered province, and the arms and armour are displayed, they're a sort of distillation of that culture. They almost seem to stand to the otherworldly concerns of art, subsuming the grisliness of reality. These are trophy reliefs at the base of Trajan's column. Somewhat perversely, when there was a trip from the BSR with the opportunity to climb Trajan's column, what really impressed me were the Dacian trophy reliefs at the base. I remain hopeful that one day I might transpose pret-a-manger recyclables, coffee cup lids and plastic knives into such a fantastically musical arrangement. Cup lids and plastic cutlery are now irretrievably muddled with the trophy in my mind. Here, a fiendish kaleidoscopic surface of arms and armour has been cajoled into dancing. And it's just kind of pitch perfect in the way that these sort of chainmail shirts and so on are sort of slumping and sort of tumbling in different directions. It's pitch perfect. As with anything that really catches you unawares, it's hard to say precisely what's so exquisite about it, and hard to crowbar any quotations either, as literature on the base of the column seems scant, but it's the department of rhythm and poise. That's a fantastic relief from the Monte Martini Museum. If these trophy reliefs are hard, durable forms with definitely contoured profiles, seemingly embossed from the marble, Howard Hodgkin's paintings are to do with layered softnesses, assertive calligraphic marks that work in concert with those that melt, feather, vanish, occasionally curdle. But they are to do with a sort of dance made with a kind of sprig, a flower arrangement of image, experience and cultural digestion distilled. Hodgkin's may be more in the realm of liquefaction and blurring than the hard-edged logo-like trophy reliefs, but his paintings could be understood as a kind of trophy, in that he seeks to find a condensed equivalent for remembered situations in a sort of garlanded, framed, ornamental form. After India, Italy is a frequently recurring backdrop for Hodgkin, Venetian memoirs being a favourite subject. This painting of there's a couple on this subject, dubbed Patrick in Italy, refers to that poet of empty restaurants, his contemporary Patrick Caulfield. A night in Vignanello, a town outside Rome, in the summer. The next night we would see the most extravagantly sustained display of fireworks, almost obscene in its showiness. Perhaps demonstrative frippery was the local speciality, as a dessert that Alice ordered at a local trattoria suggested. On a secluded terrace, we took in the dusk. The complexity of a wooded hillside, with its intricate bristled surface, gradually dimmed and smeared into a solid black silhouette, a sort of austere shoulder against the last gasp of the twilight. Alice decided to order millefolie, whose name is ordinarily something of a hyperbole. But the proprietor of the trattoria accepted her order with a sort of mischievous air, rather telegraphing that he had some kind of surprise for the out-of-towners. "You like Nutella, yes?" He returned with a plate laden with a sort of cloud of sugar and cocoa-dusted cream puffs that could have catered a small wedding, and he seemed to revel in what was either a kind of visual gag or a challenge. Perhaps we would have dined for free if she had finished it. Now I'm left with a painterly memory that really should be passed on to Howard Hodgkin. The declaratory arrival of the millefolie, but the lightness of its gesture, all golden, cream and browns, spotlit by the terrace lighting, against the blue and black of the nighttime landscape, how he could distill and reach for those parallel equivalents to incidental forms. Good and bad grattachecche. One warm afternoon, beginning to wend our way back towards Piazza del Popolo and the dusty wooded slope of bus stops that approaches the Galleria Nazionale and the British School at Rome, somewhere near the recent structure housing the Ara Pacis like a glass and marble cool box, Alice and I decided to try a grattachecche from a roadside stand. We must have been thirsty and sugar crashing, as it's the kind of decision that now seems hard to fathom. Summoning the grattachecche stand now, it's similar in form to a newspaper and magazine stand, not the hexagonal sentry boxes one sees in Rome, but a simpler, sort of rudimentary box-like shelter, dusky and coated in a layer of sootiness from an age of traffic. In the opening hatch, various translucent bottles of coloured syrup, rustically labelled in sun-bleached marker pen. An unreal feeling pervaded the arrangement of these bottles, as in the display of everyday objects in a house museum, the bits and bobs of artist equipment and personal effects in the studio at the top of Giorgio de Chirico's apartments, for example. And while the objects were plausibly present, their lack of use and apparent prolonged stasis in the relative flow of the world was palpable and lended them a feeling of remoteness and contrivance. The woman within, of indeterminate age, rather haggard and shrouded in unruly hair, might have been compared to the imagined medieval villages one sees in films of the late 80s and early 90s. Somehow it may have been decades since she last left the kiosk, the swirls of motorini and tour groups on segways eddying around her penumbral station. Alice selected a common or garden fruit flavour, but, with questionable instinct, I opted for what claimed to be cola, regressing to my childhood policy that if Coke was available, even in imitation approximate form, you took it. Disconcertingly, when the kiosk lady reached for the bottle, the cola syrup appeared like disturbed pond water, its contents separate and apparently in some process of decay. But the shards of ice she served were real enough, and slugged over them the syrup didn't look quite so bad. Perhaps I told myself it was great to get a refreshment from an earthy, unvarnished place. Great not to be fussy. As we ambled away, Alice asked suspiciously how it was. And the first tasting notes to report were untroubling, delivering coldness and sweetness. But as the already formidable May sunshine took the edge off the ice's masking power, another presence was revealed in the flavour profile. Lemon losing an argument with mould. Perhaps I wouldn't finish this, I conceded, as we approached the Flaminian Gate, already looking for somewhere to jettison the cup, just as the first storm clouds began to circle in my guts. Later that summer, on Ferragosto, Marco decided to show me the ambrosial heights of what grattachecche could be at Sora Maria. In the tranquilizing reverie of the mid-August heat, people seemed to become like cats, sloping around, conserving energy, patiently attending to their comfort. And so a handful of quiet characters was scattered around, each at their own perch, impassively supping at tall plastic cups. This was an altogether more fragrant kiosk, like a mossy, cold spring grotto. A pair of women with honey leather skin and bottled auburn hair were attending to myolica pots of ingredients. A different proposition to, say, the blitzed homogeneous smoothie, a grattachecche with all the extras, comprises more or less granular ingredients, all significantly chunkier than, say, a breakfast cereal involves, but similarly tumbled together and nestling on a liquid base. Sugar cube-sized lumps of coconut and hefty slices of cheddar or lemon, strewn in muscular ice and laced with the syrup of your choice. A bountiful aggregate blending all the fragrant balms and coolants we need in the heat. That such texture could be soothing in hot weather was news to me. Previously, all treats and remedies had been beverages that slipped down easily, yielding ice cream or factureless lollies for licking. But it's true, the pointed woodiness of the coconut and the delicious but fibrous puckering flesh of the cheddar are a sort of tactile entertainment, unchallenging but variegated enough to distract from tetchiness, a bit like the mobiles we hang in a baby's carry cot. Mark had pointed out that on the wall behind the kiosk, some vocal grattachecche enthusiast had spray painted the legend in Roman slang, El Mayor Grattachecche di Roma. Gelato. This was my introduction to proper ice cream at the age of about 14. And more than once, I've actually dreamt that gelato has vanished, moved, or merged with another establishment and gone dramatically downhill. Where in reality, you pick your way through side streets that incline and subside with undulating cobbles, and rounding a corner, it suddenly greets you like an apparition of green brass and cream. In the dreams, or more accurately nightmares, it's a sort of grail, a truth that can't be found. And this must be because, in a way, I've depended on it. If I know one thing in this world, it's that gelato is good. Since I was 14 or so, it's a recommendation I've been able to make with absolute confidence, either taking acquaintances there in person and basking in the vicarious frisson of their first cone, or dispatching them with directions and trying to suppress that unmerited smugness so hard to resist when people report back on a recommendation with especially emphatic thanks. You weren't joking. So good, isn't it? The pistachio is extraordinary. Where the ice creams and sorbets are served, at popular times there is a throng of people, but it is possible to circumvent them and be served surprisingly quickly, because firstly, many newcomers are in a state of dazzled indecision, and secondly, those unfamiliar with the system of paying in Italian bars will be sent to the cashier by the door to obtain a receipt to be brandished. Those used to ice cream parlors in America and Britain may make the entitled request to try flavors with a tiny fluorescent spade, and these may be tolerated or suffered up to a point with a pained look by the waistcoated men behind the counter. One may choose 3 flavors, and they like someone willing to commit to a decision, though they may arch an eyebrow or even challenge tin-eared combinations. They like even more someone who will agree to a spatula of panna, cream made in-house, smeared gently on top. Most decline it, even when the server has implored with moistening eyes. "È buona?" But I found it can be worth having the cream, superior to most, but still innately superfluous and bland. Hey, it's cream. But just to emphasize the intensity of the gelato, as, say, the rude health of the fruity di Bosco bursts through the anemic, soapy padding layer of cream. Now and then people announce that certain colours in paintings could be put in the category of ice creamy, and occasionally colours I have mixed have drawn this comment. And I can see why. I have a predilection for mixing Naples yellow into sap green and making something like pistachio, and I struggle not to reach too often for a range of eggy yellows and ochres. But such comparisons always invite the contradiction. Yes, but on the other hand, they're nothing like ice cream, are they? As all similes can be seen as hastily erected speculative constructs. As the writer Edward St. Aubyn has commented, he's addicted to simile. Similes only have to be imagined, never explained. Painting surfaces are attributed with practically every associative property. Naturally, its formulations are infinitely complex, and it's protean in its application, and naturally we reach for comparisons, parallels in the natural and confected world, for the effects and appearances of paint. But ultimately, looked at with an unflinching eye, it is its own domain that looks only like itself, only expanses of a particular coloured paste, and never beeches, knees, or artichokes. Having said that, the counter of Giolitti is very much like a sort of celestial palette. If it was somehow possible to paint with these, you wouldn't be wanting for many colours. You have the earth tones, an embarrassment of riches there, something close to black, wonderful bruised reds and purples. Even whites, admittedly the somewhat delicate and temperamentally textured riso and coconut. Just think what you could do with the cream. Puffs of steam, lingering vapor trails, exclamatory gestures, it would be well suited to all these. You would have to forgo blue, understandably not found in the Giolitti range. And the blue ice creams I have seen, such as the Lazio flavour at a bar overlooking Lake Bracciano, that still had a photo from Paul Gascoigne's Roman sojourn, paling behind the bar, are blues I would not pick up too often at the paint shop. A kind of irredeemably clunking blue, the colour of one of Thomas de Tenkingen's friends, the phthalo or mock cerulean found in the more economic paint ranges I've never been able to tame, to persuade to chat to other colours. I've been advised that Viagra blue and Smurf blue have also been spotted. Speaking of Gascoigne, my first awareness of Italy really came through Channel 4's broadcasting of Serie A games in Football Italia, which from the mid-90s to the early noughties broadcast live games on a Sunday, and the magazine roundup show Gazzetta Football Italia on a Saturday morning. Fronted by James Richardson, who would customarily be stationed at a cafe table with a cappuccino and a pastry, or sometimes a tauntingly decadent dessert in a sundae glass, toting the pale pink Gazzetta dello Sport. The light and air in the games appeared rarefied, the pitches and stadia subtly different, and often broiling in flare smoke. The programme is name-checked with nostalgic reverence, much in the way I'm doing now, but so frequently by football podcast pundits that it seems safe to deduce it has a canonical place in pop cultural folklore, and I'm sure must have kindled the interest of many Italophiles. One online football scribe even cites D.H. Lawrence when conveying the feeling its distinctive theme tune would evoke, sending you back down the vista of the years. I think it's worth hearing it.
Gelato di calcio italiano.
I'm sick to death of you.
Yeah, on a sort of side note, that golazzo is a bit of a falsehood because it's not something an Italian fan would ever say. Golazzo is a thing that Spanish commentators would say. But in fact, apparently this was the guy who composed the music, just put in as a sort of holding lyric, Go Lazio, because that's where Gascoigne was playing at the time and it just remained. But this was responsible for a generation of school kids in England when someone was kind of waiting to take a penalty, sort of chanting Go Lazio, as if it was conjuring sort of Serie A intensity, but it was wrong. But I suppose there's a kind of truth in that. Rather like the game Civilization, where an area of land is illuminated little by little, and tiles of scouted terrain are surrounded by an oblivion of black unseen, seeing Football Italia, an idea of Italy was opened up for me, although a mediated and somewhat imaginary one. The difference between the version based on the exported popular version and the granular reality faced when I first went to Rome and Italy made a deep impression on me, something to do with the distorting power in representing and repackaging an idea. Back to the gelato palette, the other problem would be the lack of off-kilter or queasy bilious colours to play the relatively thankless supporting roles that go unnoticed. 4 or 5 lovingly modulated, attractive tones in painting, if you want to think that way, edible colours will often be opened up and enlivened by the introduction of a less healthy tone. Perhaps the closest would be the espresso granita, strangely ominous with its oily metallic brown lurking in the depths of glistening crystals, known to cause palpitations, shakes and nausea through a surreptitious overdose of caffeine. I think perhaps I enjoy not most the eating, but the surveying of the ice creams in their tubs, hacked and scooped away at, in greater density, richness, and chromatically ravishing in a way that never quite survives being dolloped into a cone or copper. The untouched refill tub of mint just docked into place, like its surface like a pristine meadow. Just as valid a point in the cycle as the last scrapings of watermelon, clinging, harried and prone against the gleaming steel. Giolitti's banana tastes just like perfect banana emulsified, and the colour is not the pastel yellow used for foam banana sweets, but the dignified, pale greyish, brownish colour of soba noodles or biscuit-fired clay. As it yields to the passion of the mouth, as Rachel Cusk observes, the distinct realms of flavour begin to lose their definition, losing their identity in, I have to say, a sort of lyrical nuance. A field of unadulterated colour is one kind of intensity, but one vanishing smeared into another has a particular pull. It's seeing the passage of something, one colour bleeding into another, forever changed. My final trip to the Museo della Civiltà Romana during my residency here, I went on a bike along the Tiber, one of the BSR bikes, and it actually proceeded to literally fall apart as I was riding there in the August heat past the sleepy graffiti. So I had to stop, appropriately enough for visiting that Roman museum where everything is a copy, the second outpost of Giolitti by the artificial lake. Back in the museo, I love these maps. There's something very beautiful about this, where you have this kind of heat map, the world known to the Romans, directly, indirectly, and unknown. And they remind me of Alberto Burri's Sistante cycle of paintings made for Venice Biennale of the late 80s. They also remind me somewhat of like contemporary restaurant signage. This is a cast in that museum of the well-known Hadrianic boar hunt tondo of 130 to 138 AD. When I came to the British School at Rome from London, the only piece of material that I brought with me, because I hadn't quite figured out why I was interested in it, was a takeaway coffee cup lid. I stood it on a shelf in the studio, and the coffee cup lid only seemed to become more captivating as time went on, and I noticed that takeaway coffee in that form didn't exist in Rome, but at the same time I was seeing all these, in Roman reliefs, these tondo formats. And this has kind of been responsible for a sort of tondo disorder in me, where I see them everywhere and try and incorporate them into my work. That's, I think, when we went on a visit to Portus, and there was this horrifying bin load of yellow plastic tableware at the end. Pret-a-manger trophy, Katsukoi trophy, marbling. And these are a few of my works that I think we might discuss briefly with Marco at the end, that more than ever I see how these absorbed a lot of the language of those trophy reliefs and something about the arrangement of things. That's a large tondo format work. In the Museo della Civiltà Romana, this is a great Hadrianic frieze put together, completed, because the original one was actually hacked to bits, and pieces of it were included in the Arch of Constantine, and also the Hadrianic boar hunt roundel is in that, and it's a fascinating monument to think about in terms of maybe sort of artists who curate contemporary art shows where, because the whole arch is kind of like a vast megalomaniacal scrapbook of different things. Battle sarcophagi. These became more widely used from the time of Trajan. This is the Portinaccio sarcophagus, AD 190, where you see prisoners and trophies creating a frame at the edge, kind of buffering this insane insectoid jumble of forms that looks chaotic at first but soon reveals a systematic rhythm. It has a sort of Ray Harryhausen feel. The dying German cavalry are very amenable in collapsing and expiring in a variety of positions that maintain our visual interest, creating dizzying turns to offset the stiff diagonals of the swords and spears. And at the bottom, some of the things are even kind of melting into the base. This and the other one that I'll show you have just remained in my mind as a sort of high watermark of an extreme of something kind of highly wrought and just incredibly complex. This is a slightly later Ludovisi sarcophagus, perhaps the last of the great battle sarcophagi. If a little less viscerally spooky, perhaps due to its greater degree of polish, it's an immensely complex, knotted, noodled form. There seem to be even fewer pockets of air than in the Portinaccio, and like a bowl of noodles or spaghetti, everything intertwines. Every movement is part of a greater overall mass, sliding, surging, and subsiding in indecent proximity. The occasional single strand of like a horn or a dangling arm, as if asking for a fork to extract them from the pile-up. But generally no sooner have you observed one vignette than it's been interrupted by a shield or someone dying. Only the person being honoured, his head individuated as a portrait by a specialist, seems to rise above the melee, extending his hand in a sort of waving gesture and recasting the whole scene as a sort of allegory for all sorts of battles and struggles. In the Museo Paul di Pezzoli in Milan, sorry, it's a terrible photo from an old iPhone. In the Museo Paul di Pezzoli, there's a room conceived and arranged by the 20th century sculptor Arnaldo Pomodoro, whose own work has been mined by contemporary figures like Carol Bove and Stephen Claydon. At the museum's collection of arms and armour, he devised a sort of bespoke space with niches and combed concrete. And inside, great care has been taken with the visual rhythm and counterbalance. And I think he arrives at a level of refinement that presents the objects in a sort of flow, a bit akin to extemporaneous speech, as if to say, one might look at things this way, or this way. And this is one of my paintings that I think absorbed ideas of the bas relief with enlarged takeaway coffee cups and plastic cutlery. And some others. The Nile mosaic at Palestrina, late 2nd century, showing the passage of the Nile from Ethiopia to the Mediterranean. It shows the Roman fascination with Egyptian exoticism and the genre of the Nilotic landscape. It may have been mentioned in Pliny's Natural History. At the top, you have a river in a relatively empty landscape, winding its way past numerous vignettes, and at the bottom, the relatively realistic depiction of the Nile Delta and flood. I loved the various day trips you could make in Lazio, and the journeying into a smaller town to see perhaps one thing of interest has a way of fixing in your memory the thing with a particular definition. A hot day on a stifling blue attack bus, making all the local stops, and once deposited in Palestrina, climbing a fierce cobbled hill to reach the museum which crowned it. The river here is depicted almost as brushstrokes that sweep from side to side, a bit like the squeegee of a window cleaner, creating a slow lateral ping-pong, like a meditative Abax painting. Layers of existence are telescoped together, the fine banded lines of the water like tree rings, intervals. What impressed me about this, let alone the economy and eloquence of the incidental detail with tiny tesserae. In a sense, with mosaics, there's no obfuscation or fudging possible, no smoke and mirrors, were the sort of slivers of shadow and reflections that seem to anchor things in place, or a bit like slits or pockets to insert the motif as a paper doll. They create rippling effects that allow for recession without any predominating perspective, and it has the top to bottom floating unity of a Japanese print. One of my strongest memories from my time here was actually the month of August, when there weren't many residents at the BSR, but the studio sort of really started ticking along, and the humid air of the studio was scented by raw MDF and the tang of silicon rubber catalyst. And I experienced some aesthetic high points working on these reliefs, watching the light change and the shadows wend their way over the surface of the fiberboard reliefs. Perhaps dining in the evening at Il Bacchetto when there was no food provided. La Barca Pronto. Some years later, at the well-loved sushi restaurant cum supermarket in Milan, Poporoia Shiro, the waitress comes over and asks if we're ready because La Barca Pronta, the sushi boat, was ready. It's one of those phrases that seems to be still echoing in my head years later. It sounded immediately mysterious at the time, as if it had some kind of hidden meaning. Where are we going? The underworld? Now it calls to mind another Lazio day trip to Lake Nemi. Famed for its strawberries, and indeed in Nemi you can buy produce derived from strawberries that I'm pretty sure you've never imagined. The town nestles on the rim of a caldera, the rim of the crater softened by vegetation so rampant it almost disturbs. Nemi is home to one of the most absurdly sad stories I've ever heard. It was long rumoured that sunk at the bottom of the lake were golden pleasure barges created for Caligula of eye-searing decadence. Requiring feats of engineering, the uprooting of many local people, amidst fear of malarial plague being triggered, Mussolini eventually drained the lake, and indeed found some Roman ships, if not golden, then formidable examples, and built a custom museum to house them. But if you want an example of the pure absurdity, just a couple of years later, the ships having rested safely at the bottom of the lake for thousands of years, a bomb was dropped, a firebomb that burned them to smithereens, leaving only bronze fixtures, lead piping, and some nails. There is something exquisite about the way that lead piping is shown, though, I think. We had a nice lunch after on a precariously homemade balcony, but this bliss was interrupted tellingly by a couple of locals from a party inside who came out to smoke. Robin Veal, a charcoal specialist who was at the BSR at the time, who drove us there, cheerfully but directly pointed out to these guys that the smoke was bothering us while we were eating. A man with silver hair, like slightly grown out stubble of a harvested wheat field, with a V-shaped furrowed brow, whose features have now been substituted in my mind by those of the character Phil in The Sopranos, whose head gets run over by an SUV. Scusi, di dove sei? Oh, I was from Australia, but I've worked in Italy for a long time. Di dove sei? Adesso siamo a Roma. La Barca Pronto to E la nave va. This is the replica street in Cinecittà, and round the corner from here, you see the first scene of the film E la nave va, the ship goes on. I think Fellini's penultimate film, or perhaps almost penultimate film. Perhaps not his finest, but with many ravishing, spectacularly fake scenes. With the sparkling plastic sea, the characters lean on this railing and gaze, in a sense, at nothing. The ship sails on. I couldn't resist finishing with this tomb door from Tarquinia, one of the Etruscan wall paintings. I really felt afraid that if I pushed it, then I might have gone through to the afterlife. Thanks very much.